Good afternoon. Good afternoon, people at home over there. I should be looking at the camera. And people here in this room. It's a hybrid session of the China Knowledge Network Knowledge Session. It's well, first of all, my name is Floris Harm. I'm director of the Leiden Asia Center. And the China Knowledge Sessions are organized this time by the Leiden Asia Center, who's asked to organize it on behalf of the China Knowledge Network, which is a network established to connect China experts and disseminate knowledge about China within the government and beyond. And one way of doing this is these knowledge sessions where we talk about relevant topics. Well, today is an extremely relevant topic, I would argue. It's about semiconductors, and more specifically about China's semiconductor industry. It's relevant because, I mean, it's often argued that data is the new oil. If that's the case, then semiconductors could be construed as the tankers, the rigs, and everything that comes with transporting the oil, let's say. Semiconductors are the brains of modern technology that facilitate economic development and national security and global competitiveness. And it's not surprising that it's also a keystone in the Sino-US rivalry. And we're very honored to have with us one of Europe's leading experts on the topic, John Lee. Thank you very much for coming all the way from Berlin, by train no less, which wasn't easy this time. I have to mention this, even disregarding the rain. So John will be making some remarks in a minute. After that, Leiden University's own assistant professor Rogier Kremers, also an expert in the cyber domain, will comment on John's remarks. Well, it's about the current state of affairs and perhaps what the development of Huawei's next generation of phone says about the American attempts to limit China's capabilities. Before I give the floor to John, a couple of things. I just was talking to the camera because this knowledge session is hybrid and will be live streamed. John's remarks and Rogier's comments will be recorded and can be also watched later on the website of the China Knowledge Network. The Q&A, however, afterwards will be live streamed but not recorded, so it gives everybody an opportunity to talk perhaps a little bit more freely. After this session, there will be some drinks with a networking opportunity. So, you know, in case you decide to stay at home next time. Anyway, without further ado, John, please, if I invite you to.
Thank you very much, Floris.
Presentation.
I'm always glad to visit Melbourne. It involves a 5-hour delay courtesy of time, but that is the last that I will complain about. Today, you have my promise. Again, thank you very much to Leiden Asia Center, Floris, who are here, and of course to Emma for putting in the legwork to make this happen. I would proceed at a trot. I always like to leave more time for the Q&A for these things, but basically I'll break up my remarks into 3 broad buckets. Where does the Chinese industry sit in the global semiconductor sector today? Broadly speaking, what is the purpose and effectiveness of the US export controls? And then, I guess of most interest to many in the room, what are the geopolitical ramifications, in particular, in terms of a potentially technologically fragmented world? So it's a lot of syllables for an introduction, but as I said, proceed through it at a trot. If anyone does have a particular question that they would like to throw at me, then you know, you're welcome to maybe give me a little signal at some point in the presentation. I'll make a mental note. But firstly, the Chinese industry. I will take this opportunity to plug the new volume published by Roman and Littlefield, of which Rogier is one editor, and which I've contributed a chapter. It's an open access volume, and my one is on the Chinese semiconductor industry. It's a part of history. It's not as long as Chris Miller's book, but it is focused on the Chinese industry, and it provides a bit of context in the deep dive. So I would definitely recommend that to anyone who's interested in the subject, doesn't mind to plow through, let's say, 35 pages of fairly dense material. But let's boil it down to this. The Chinese semiconductor industry, up until, let's say, the last couple of years, has basically been an extension of the global industry. And that may sound very mundane, but I think it's important to put in context everything that you hear about the Chinese drive for self-reliance and never mind the emergence of a China-oriented tech sphere in the world. Up until very recently, this industry was an outgrowth of a globalized supply chain. And of course, there's nothing surprising about that because this is the way that all of the East Asian economies climb the ladder. And this is, I think, something I try to convey in the chapter in the aforementioned book, that while we think about the Chinese model often as very unique, and it does have its salient characteristics, it is drawing heavily on the example that was set, including specifically in the semiconductor industry, by the other East Asian tiger economies. That term sometimes applied to Malaysia, Singapore, and Hong Kong, but by that I mean, of course, first Japan, then South Korea, and then Taiwan. The example that was set in industrial policy, state-led efforts to upgrade, to, as one author puts it, create industries rather than technology, sort of benefit from existing knowledge and supply chains and carve out of space. Is the model that China has followed. And that was working about as well for them as you could expect, up until the point where it became a geopolitical issue with the United States. So if we talk about, let's say, before the really significant escalation of export controls in the last couple of years, the model that the Chinese had settled on by the mid-2010s was really one of applying this grand steerage concept, which many of you will be familiar with. Barry Norton coined the concept, but it's quite a widespread way of conceptualizing how the Chinese state relates to priority industrial sectors by using, let's say, a finger on the wheel to try and steer the industry in desired directions while throwing a lot of cash at it and other support measures, but essentially letting the private sector's dynamism and connections into global supply chains and global industries do the work. This was the approach they had settled on by the 2010s. And if again, I may plug an older report of mine. There's a graphic in the 2021 report that I authored with Jan Peter Kleinhans for my former employer, the Cultural Institute of China Studies, which has a tree diagram basically conceptualizing the Chinese ecosystem and showing how different bits fit together within this context. So you've got, for example, the steering bodies at the top, you've got the government guidance funds, which in the case of the semiconductor big fund have always been run, or the big fund has always been run by ex-China Development Bank executives. And it's under MWIT's supervision to give you an idea of how close this is to the Chinese state. But then, of course, you have the R&D sector, the state-run research institutions, the private sector companies, all of this coming together basically to play the Chinese competitive advantages and to accumulate, and this is the key point I would like anyone who reads my chapter in the book to take away, to accumulate domestically the resources to advance technically, which is what the other East Asian economies did before it. So if you distinguish this from, let's say, the Indian experience with information technology, to put a fine point on it, one of the distinguishing features for China's relative success in this and other sectors has been its ability to follow that East Asian precedent and to develop companies like Huawei, as the best known example, which have the knowledge and human capital and financial resources to basically start running by themselves and indeed pushing the technological frontier. This is what distinguishes the East Asian economies and their ability to climb the value chain in the tech ladder from basically the rest of the developing world. So that's basically the nice picture that was blown up by the escalation of US export controls starting from the, let's say, early Trump administration. Now, I imagine I probably burned through already most of the 15 minutes that I planned to use for this presentation, so I will canter through this quite quickly. I think it's probably better addressed in the Q&A. Some of the points of detail, particularly about the recent round, only 2 or 3 weeks ago, the expansion of the October 2022 controls. But let's say that politically, I will acknowledge that, of course, this is not a simple matter of the United States having decided it wants to cut China down. There's a long history to this, and it's never the case that all of the blame is on one side. Nonetheless, for the purposes of this framing, let's say that the so-called weaponization of interdependence and the reason why the Chinese industry is now striving for self-reliance and input substitution, the impetus is from the American side, not from the Chinese side, at least in terms of the motive force within the past few years. So, of course, we had the export controls targeting Huawei as an individual company, which were introduced in 2019 and especially 2020, not the first, but definitely the severe ones that aimed effectively to kneecap Huawei as a technological actor, at least one that could push the frontier. But then what you had basically under the Biden administration in 2022, a year ago, was the expansion of controls to the whole Chinese economy. So this, the key thing to understand, is no longer a targeting of individual Chinese firms, though of course that was done, and it was done again in the new round last month. But the concept now, as many of you will have read, is to keep China as an entire economy behind the United States, as Jake Sullivan put it, not just a couple of generations, but as far as possible for strategic reasons. And that's framed in the new round of controls, as well as the ones from October last year, in terms of military applications and human rights abuses. Don't want them to have cutting-edge military technology, cutting-edge mass surveillance technology that can be used for human rights abuses. This is the reason for the controls. So to quickly wrap this up and then get on to the tech fragmentation bit, more as a framing for the Q&A and the discussion. I think it's fair to say that the US approach is still normally one of the small yard and the high fence. So once again, the policy justification remains the same. And the controls are targeted in the sense that certainly as far as, I'm now talking about the more recent ones, so the ones that were the expansion from last month, are targeted at so-called advanced computing and the capabilities associated with that. So still, if you like, the most advanced end of the technology stack, at least if you're talking about certain things like advanced fabrication and performance density, talk about one of the metrics for the chips that was introduced with the recent round. The problem is that, as you are already seeing, the Chinese industry has progressed to the point where targeting exquisite nodes, if you like, in the supply chain is no longer enough to stop advances, which is where you have, for instance, the demonstration effect of the new Huawei chip, the KN9000S, which was revealed, let's say, back in September, and which, according to the Mir reporting, has definitely, and certainly in the open political conversation of Washington, has been a big factor in driving, a refocus on the need to kneecap the Chinese industry, or at least contain it to a point where it will not present a competitive threat to US technological leadership in future. But although we can get into a discussion about why that shouldn't have been as big a surprise, the reality is that the Chinese industry has now reached a point in many sectors where they are not at the cutting edge. They can't do everything else for themselves, but they have enough capacity. Again, this idea of accumulating the resources domestically, where you will not be able to stop technological advance in its tracks by simply targeting something like, let's say, EUV lithography, the most obvious of the exquisite technological choke points. Yes, you can achieve certain things by doing that, but if you want to see a broad, if you like, hobbling of Chinese technological progress, especially in applied technologies, and at the end of the day, chips and semiconductors are just inputs, right? That's why they're called foundational technologies. They're used for other things that do certain end uses, which is what people are really interested in. Then a narrow approach is not going to work at this point because the Chinese industry has simply come too far. This is before you get into the issue of the enforceability of the export controls, which again is a very interesting discussion we can have in the Q&A. But let's just say that, I've had another conversation quite recently where someone gave the example that by at least one analyst assessment, the Russian Federation could meet its needs for the semiconductors, I think maybe specifically the guidance chips, for its cruise missile production for a year, simply from one smuggled briefcase. I mean, we're not talking about large objects, right? And that's, I guess, a good anecdote as a point of reference for the challenges with monitoring and enforcement of export controls. Which is also a topic which has received much discussion. It's one of, I think, the issues that really fed into the new round of controls that were introduced last month, because many of them target specific circumvention, whether it's routing to third-party jurisdictions or the way in which the metrics were described to basically plug loopholes from the October regime last year. But the key point to take away from that is that the enforcement challenge is a very large part of this piece, which is often neglected. And you have to consider it when making the overall policy evaluation. But just to wrap this up in a few minutes, we get to the technological fragmentation. It will be no secret, I think, to anyone who has the interest in this subject to be sitting here that not everyone in the world, even if we talk about national governments, is, let's say, like-minded, to use terminology, when it comes to the risks from Chinese technology. Even here in the European Union, we can talk specifically, particularly, we won't call it Chatham House rules, but let's say in the more confined environment, once the live stream recording stops. or rather, once the section that will be posted onto the internet stops, about the situation with the Netherlands and the politics, if you like, around the expansion of, let's say, US unilateral controls which target certain Dutch companies. But if we think about the developing world as a whole, this is obviously a topic which, again, you read about much in the commentary on geoeconomics, geopolitics around tech these days. Most of the economic growth, and especially the mass uptake of digital technologies around the world, is happening in what used to be called the third world. In certain parts of the world, like Southeast Asia, especially, which are more exposed to Chinese influence, if you want to call it that, and more integrated with China's economy than is the case many other places. And in these countries, there is not the appetite for, let's say, a wall of solidarity against allowing Chinese technology in. You can use certain metrics, like, let's say, 5G technology, where, you know, countries like Indonesia, 270 million people, critical strategic location in Southeast Asia, and also critical to, obviously, the electric vehicle supply chain because of minerals exports and other things, now is basically equipping its next generation telecoms networks with, quite happily, with Huawei and ZTE equipment. So that is obviously a divergence, if you like, at a fundamental strategic level from the default position in, let's say, the US aligned bloc, whatever the differences of opinion may be, you know, at a more nuanced level. But those are still significant because, again, as we'll get to with the issue of ASML and with the restrictions on it and certain other Dutch companies in terms of their ability to do business with China, even there, the politics can be quite fraught, right? So this is, I guess, a quick tour to set the scene for why I say that I personally would be very skeptical that we see a Cold War II situation where you have, let's say, well-defined technological blocks, one aligned to the United States, one aligned to China. Again, those of you who have read up on this subject will know that it's actually not the case, that in the first Cold War, if you want to call it that, these were hermetically sealed blocks. There was actually a decent amount of technological and economic exchange, even with the old Eastern Bloc under the Soviet Union. But it's nothing compared to the level of globalization that we have today, and which, although the Chinese industry is now striving, you know, manfully for the highest degree of self-reliance it can reach, is still very much characterizing, especially very high value added complex supply chains like semiconductors. So the starting point is very different. And what I think we're much more likely to see is a patchwork situation where you have very messy environment of, let's call it, overlapping technological spheres of influence. Chinese and American companies competing side by side, as you already see, more in, let's say, emerging markets like Southeast Asia's rather than in the advanced economies, but nonetheless, certainly not the case where many jurisdictions are clearly oriented to one pole rather than the other. And of course, as far as the Chinese industry's progress goes, this means that the idea of cutting China off technologically from either foreign inputs or foreign markets is going to have to be very heavily qualified. I think one point to leave you with in closing, before we can is that, again, there's been a lot of focus on the exquisite technologies, you know, the EUV lithography, the most complex technology that mankind has ever invented, and so on. You can do a lot of stuff without that, and you can do a lot of stuff without cutting-edge fabrication. I mean, the example is always given of the phone in your pocket having however many more times computing power than the machine that sent Apollo mission to the moon, right? That's your smartphone. But really, most of the global economy does not run on smartphones, right? Even this, as a representative product, is actually quite misleading, I would suggest, in terms of the overall implications of, let's say, a technological containment policy targeting certain semiconductor production nodes. Because the older generation technologies, if you talk about industries at scale, especially, automation of manufacturing, electric vehicles, whatever the case may be, even data centers, a lot of stuff can be done with technology that's not restricted at all, even by the US regulations at the current point in time. And many of the impacts that come from, let's say, the expansion of Chinese presence in these industries doesn't come from pushing the technology in a hard sense at the frontier, but from the implementation, the economies of scale, the tailoring of solutions to individual requirements, all areas in which the Chinese, to be quite frank, have been more successful often than Western competitors in many contexts, certainly within their own country. So that has been a very whirlwind tour of the problem. I hope that that's a good framing for the general discussion. And at this point, I'll hand back to my esteemed colleague Roger for a view on how we dive into this further.
Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you very much, Tom. But back in China, still jet lagged. I'd like to sort of make a few remarks about the broader context of this and the policy considerations that brings also for domestic politics. First, I would like to make a small announcement of a somewhat more personal nature, which is I'm very happy to have received news today that the director of the Leiden Asia Center, Florian Schneider, has been appointed full professor, Hochlehrer of Chinese Studies at Leiden University. He's in the room, Florian. Many congratulations, and it's a wonderful signal for contemporary China studies in the Netherlands that the university has chosen to make this appointment. And it's been a pleasure working with him as associate professor, and I'm sure it will be even more of a pleasure to continue in his capacity as a full professor. So again, our best wishes, and it's a wonderful thing also for the China Knowledge Network. Now to talk about somewhat more depressing things, it's how the world is going to get a lot poorer. Why do I say that? Because we are living through the end of an economic system of organization, of which the semiconductor kerfuffle, I think, is the most visible symptom. And that is that the Chinese economy is very rapidly moving from complementarity with Western economic systems to competitiveness. And the reason for that is very simple. In 1992, China's per capita GDP was about $450 a year. In 2000, it was just under 1,000. Last year, it was 12,000. And obviously, that means that to continue growing, China needs to deploy different activities. In comparison, Dutch GDP per capita is about 48,000. So we are 4 times as wealthy per person, or at least 4 times as productive per person, than China is. China wants to make that up. And the only way in which it can do that is increasingly competing with us in those activities at the top of the global food chain that we have thus far kept for ourselves. And if we look at the semiconductor value chain, we love talking about ASML. It's a wonderful company. We love talking about TSMC, which is a great company. We find it somewhat more difficult to forget that in this ecosystem also contains many children in Africa who are getting cobalt and other minerals and metals out of the ground in rather less salubrious circumstances. They also make a little bit of money, but if we look at the semiconductor ecosystem as an ecosystem, there are very clearly apex predators like ASML and TSMC, and there are very clearly bottom feeders who have to make do with the scraps that drop down from high. It is China's intention to move up that value chain, and that means that increasingly China wants those activities that we perform as well. And it would be my argument that for all of the protestation that semiconductor sanctions are informed by national security considerations, I would argue that there is an equally clear economic competition driver in this debate as well, where very simply we find it very difficult to tolerate China as a competitive player that we are going to have to contend with more and more. That means, however, that given the fact that we've organized the manufacturing system of the world around China, and we have optimized it on the basis of economic efficiency, that we are suddenly confronted with the fact that economic efficiency is no longer the sole or even the dominant organizing principle. Our economic interactions are becoming securitized, which automatically means that decisions will be taken for non-economic reasons, and that can be perfectly legitimate. But we must understand that this will impoverish us because we will trade economic efficiency for whatever other pursuit that we have. However, we have not yet discussed the politics of this, and yet we are already starting to see the fallout of these political considerations. In the EU and in the United States, governments are pumping billions of taxpayer dollars into the establishment of a semiconductor industry for which there simply is no economic case. we are building a semiconductor industry because we want strategic autonomy. And again, that may be a very legitimate political decision, but it's not a free political decision. And it would, I think, be an example of good democratic practice for national leaders to be far more forthright with their populations about what these things would entail. So that is one element of it. Another element is to start think through that we may not like it, but China also gets a vote in the relationship that it has with us. In very many ways, perhaps we should, in the Netherlands, thank the United States for actually increasing the semiconductor sanctions to the degree that The Hague has no effective control over ASML exports anymore. Since 2 weeks ago, the United States has essentially extraterritorially declared that it can ban, under sanctions law, the export of advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment, regardless of whether it contains any US content or not. De facto, that means that if The Hague does, that if Washington doesn't want China to get its hands on DUV machines, it can stop ASML from delivering them to China, regardless of what the democratically elected sovereign government of the Netherlands has decided. I think this is an issue worthy of consideration at the national level as well as at the European level, but at least it means that we can go to China and say that it is out of our hands, because it is. So the domestic politics, the domestic political impact of semiconductor sanctions, the second order effects, which will definitely happen. John has already talked about the incentivization of the Chinese semiconductor industry, which actually was suffering a little bit a couple of years ago as companies like Huawei wouldn't necessarily buy Chinese when they had access to TSMC chips. Why would they buy Chinese if those chips aren't necessarily better, cheaper, or in any other way competitive? Now, however, there is a very strong impetus for the entire Chinese hardware sector to invest in local, because access to foreign capabilities is no longer guaranteed. This is a gamble. And the gamble is that it is no longer preferable to ensure Chinese access to foreign technologies, which means that they have less of a strong incentive to develop indigenous capabilities. You know, essentially you create a longer lasting dependency. The American government has decided that that is less preferable to cutting China off from all of these technologies in the expectation that China will not be able to replicate all of these capabilities. Whether or not China will be able to replicate these capabilities, or whether it will find alternative ways to development, the jury is out on that, and this is something that we shall see over the next coming years. But what is undeniable is that this has concentrated minds in Beijing and Shenzhen and other tech hubs in China. We must also think through the second order effects, the extent to which China gets a vote, the extent to which we're also seeing that China has started to move on the availability of rare earths. And this is again something that shows very interesting and fascinating sign of Chinese economic policy making, where the semiconductor sanctions are aimed at denying China certain technical capabilities. China's rare earth export controls seem to be more aimed at actually upselling Chinese products, where China would prefer not to sell you the rare earth minerals themselves, but it would want to sell you the battery that is made with them, or even more preferably, to sell you the car that the battery has been mounted in. In other words, industrial policy, export control as a part of industrial policy that is very clearly aimed at capturing a greater part of global value shares. That's a lot of yakking for me, and obviously we are here for you. But just to throw some ideas into discussion, and to think that how something that we very often see as a discrete, very specific, very geeky policy area is actually going to have open-ended consequences and unpredictable dynamics that may well affect very broad swathes of the economy with no end in sight. As I said, not necessarily the most positive voice in the room, but sometimes we need to know how bad things are so that we can make them better. Thank you very much, and thank you indeed, John, for your comments.